Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Way We Grow podcast, a production of the Craft Growers Network. I'm your host, Nick Wolf. Today, our guest is Liam Spenser. You can find him at The Flying Liamer on Instagram. He is also the owner of Series Cultivation, where he helps growers optimize their cultivation process and facilities. He's also an accounts executive with Arroya.io and also provides his cultivation expertise through the Grow World Ag platform. Liam, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. Thanks for the intro. I'm doing well. I've just been, traveling a lot, trying to keep up, and just really excited to be here and have a conversation and see what we can get into.
For sure. Well, you come highly recommended for having an educated cultivation discussion by a few different sources, and so I was really excited to get you on the podcast today. What's new in your grow world? You do a lot of different things and kind of wear a few different hats. Is there anything that's kind of been at the tip of your brain lately?
Uh, you know, uh, you, Being that I'm working with Arroya and I started in September of last year, I've gotten a lot of exposure to a lot of facilities around the country, and I kind of cover from Michigan all the way over to Oregon. So I get to see sort of every stretch of the indoor and greenhouse industry in each state, and just get an idea for what people are doing, how they're doing it, and kind of understand what's working for people, what's not working, best practices, what people are interested in. So the exposure to that many facilities has been really invaluable. Obviously, I've was working for Science LED before and got to see quite a bit of facilities there, but kind of expanding outside of Colorado, the Michigan market, really highly compressed legacy markets, and really the whole breadth of performance across the board. So
Nice.
that's really been the most interesting focus for me lately.
If you can divulge anything along these lines, I would love to hear what are some of the most innovative solutions that you've seen people integrating into their cultivation facilities that maybe you hadn't seen elsewhere, or it was just a really ingenious application of something that normally may not be in that style of application.
Oh man, that's tough. There's a lot. There's a there's a lot going on and a lot to it, and I think being able to walk into a facility and see, hey, these guys are really making do with what they've got, doing the best they can with what they have. The sort of MacGyvering and ingenuity is across the board. I mean, between different methods of collecting runoff to different ways of dehumidification, sort of what the there's a lot of people running under canopy lights lately that I've seen getting great results. There's a lot of different, people playing with different spectrums. I see a lot of mixed indoor lighting, so HPS LED combo. Still see a ton of HPS lights in the market, but the guys that are really performing well seem to have a really good understanding of staff and workflow in the facility. Their cost of goods is low, and I think that some of these to kind of answer your question on specific applications, I've seen some people really string together their own sort of solution when they can't necessarily afford something like Arroya or like a agronomic IQ. There's quite a bit of hot gas reheat going around. I've seen a lot of people like kind of modifying their HVAC units to get reheat and getting really good results with stability in their humidity in their grow rooms. I think the combination of HPS and LED does help a little bit with mitigating some of the sort of high increase in transpiration that you get under LEDs alone. I mean, you still see that guys, putting far red at the end of the day and early in the morning. But yeah, I mean, it kind of all blurs together. I mean, I've seen some pretty creative things, as far as benching and drainage goes. Sort of running pipe drains under the benches, or stringing together irrigation zones. But yeah, I mean, you kind of put me on the spot there. It's kind of hard to
No, you kind
think
of touched on all the hot topics, which is really great because, of course, seeing it in application in these different, commercial facilities, it does show that this is where the market is looking right now. This is at least on the cultivation side. People are kind of forging a path, whether it be through these like far red light applications or the reheat applications of their pre-existing air conditioners so that they can get that better dehumidification capacity for the facility. These are all the things that you see a lot of people talking about and have been talking about at least for the past couple years. So it's very, I mean, telling to say that it is being seen in the market right now. But I do like to bring this podcast a little bit back to your origins as a cultivator because it sounds like you have a wealth of knowledge that you're tapping into when you're addressing these different solutions and seeing these different either problems arise that you're helping tackle and then finding the solutions for. And so that all has to come from somewhere. So all the way back, what are some of the first experiences you had with plants in general, whether it be cannabis or not? And then did it start with cannabis and go to perhaps some vegetable gardening here and there, or did you do any vegetable gardening with, mom and dad or an uncle or an aunt or something like that, and then transition any of that like passion or knowledge into cannabis?
It's a really interesting question. There's a lot of cross-pollination across both of those things. So I think, to say like my journey with cannabis started in one area, and my journey with gardening kind of started separately of that. Although when I was a kid and in high school, first started consuming cannabis, we'd always get bag seeds and try to toss them out. And we had these abandoned lots in our neighborhood that we try to grow stuff, never really turned into anything. And then when I didn't really grow plants, I wasn't super interested in growing plants as like a business or anything like, professionally until I got into college, and I changed my major to environmental science, and I got into a couple of classes like ethnobotany, and kind of led me down towards horticulture. We had a community garden on campus, and you could go there and just volunteer and work in the garden. It was a pretty decent sized garden, and you could just go there, and first time you volunteer, you're probably spreading mulch around or double digging plots or whatever was needed to be done. And then as you kind of progressed through and got a little bit more experience, they started assigning, you showed some level of proficiency too, they'd start assigning more complicated tasks like transplanting or propagation, things like that. And I got really into it. I was like, this is really exciting, starting to get a closer understanding of where my food came from and how to cultivate it in different environments. And then I got into aeroponic growing because we had a program on campus it was through like the wellness initiative where we had these aeroponic tower gardens planted all over campus, and I
Nice.
helped build them and clean them and take them down. And I got involved in this project, as a volunteer, where I'd go harvest, and then eventually got to a point where I started giving these presentations and kind of sharing how it worked and teaching people about vertical gardening and things like that. So that's where I sort of got really into the more into the soilless growing, and then did that for a long time. Had a lot of people ask me if I if I grew cannabis or if I was interested in doing that or did it in those aeroponic gardens, and I kind of was very resistant to it, kind of pushed back a little bit on it because I had gotten in trouble for cannabis in college and just kind of tried to move away from that a little
Sure.
bit at that time. But then I ended up living in a house where I was able to, we had like an area where we could cultivate in the house that was secret. So I started playing around with tent growing, and then translated that into when I graduated college, and I had kind of traveled. I kind of left Orlando and I went to Costa Rica, did my permaculture design course, stayed there to work on the farm for a couple months after that, and then went down to Ecuador and I did this like indoor, or it was an urban agriculture course, and it was a once a week class for a couple months, and I got learned kind of like what their strategies were for raised bed gardening as well, and yeah, once I kind of finished that and came back to the States, I was working with a friend of mine who had a business. He was starting a business building garden beds for people in their backyards and their front yards and different kind of projects where he was building vegetable gardens. And I got really involved, did a lot of builds, did a lot of plantings, a lot of workshops, things like that. And then I moved back to Orlando and kind of helped build another similar business up there that was a little bit more high profile, a little bit more boutique for some of the more upscale neighborhoods, community gardens, things like that, living walls.
Sure.
So I got really deeply involved in plants outside of cannabis for a while, and eventually one of my friends started working at Cureleaf in Mount Dora in Florida when they were opening, kind of before they brought plants in, and he continually tried to convince me to join over there, and I was a bit resistant to it at first, and finally he's like, all right, let's see what this is all about. I'll get in the commercial cannabis space. And
About what year was that?
that was 2018. So
Cool.
yeah, it was when Florida had gone medical. I think Trulieve had already established a couple of facilities. Cureleaf had a site down in Homestead. But this was like sort of their big project. It was about 6 acres of greenhouse, and then they had, well, by the time I left, they had expanded to building out about 250,000 square feet of indoor. So went from a team of like initially bringing on around 20 people, ended up with over 100 in cultivation alone.
Wow.
And, probably even upwards of that. We had to, during COVID, split into 2 shifts. So half the cultivation team was on 3 to 4 days a week, and the other half was split. But there were still, 100 people on each shift. So
That's crazy.
yeah, it was a massive operation. Still is really big, and they're still producing quite a lot of cannabis over there. But that was my foray into commercial cannabis outside of just tent growing. But I had so much experience growing and gardening outside of cannabis that I picked up a lot of the techniques and the procedures and practices quickly. But a big focus was on operations and efficiency and problem solving and distribution of labor and staffing. That was really where a tremendous amount of value came, because there was all of this problem solving on a daily basis we had to do to make the operations work and keep the gears turning efficiently. And so kind of having to sequence like dozens of different processes kind of all happening at once and making sure they all happened in a coordinated and efficient effort was probably the biggest part of the learning process initially there. But then I got really into the technology and the greenhouse management and managing sort of the climate in the greenhouse and using all these different controls platforms like Priva and Ritter. We had this other old platform called QCOM, which was, I guess, microgrow. And then we had an internal BAS system that was made on site in house. So there were all these different programs I had to learn, and then had to help commission the climate control system skid. So really just got deep into uncovering how all these controls and technologies worked and figuring out how to optimize them to get the best environment in that greenhouse that we could, because it was really a lot of poor design decisions went into that. So there's a lot of MacGyvering and problem solving.
Do you mind talking a little bit more about your time at Cureleaf? And I feel like with such a large facility, you could probably see some of the best aspects of the commercial cultivation industry, as well as some of the potentially the worst parts of the commercial cultivation industry, just in terms of efficiencies or discrepancies. There's a lot there to probably unpack, and whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely a lot to unpack. I fully acknowledge that there was a lot of poor decisions that were made over there, and they learned a lot. The company as a whole learned a lot in the process of retrofitting and then building out on that property. So, they spent quite a lot of money on trying to retrofit the greenhouse, and initially there was some guidance to retrofit it to make it more representative of an indoor space within the greenhouse, and with the intention being that, hey, maybe we can use AC to mitigate some of the external heat coming from Florida outdoor environment. But the execution was, there were a lot of challenges and a lot of turnover on the director side. We had a lot of leaders in that facility turn over every few months, and I think a lot of that just came down to like, playing a blame game, or trying to understand like why certain decisions that were made that spent a decent amount of capital weren't yielding results or turning into positive outcomes. That was a big part of what I was trying to do there was, hey, when I came in there, they had taken a lot of the aspects of the greenhouse that were functioning and growing orchids beforehand and sort of shut them off and tried to, do what they could to seal off the environment or make it an indoor environment. And that was probably not the best decision in the long run, but I kind of understand where they were coming from. I think they quickly realized that Florida greenhouse conditions are not optimal for cannabis of any variety. Although some, like we had Afghani that usually performed pretty well, handled the tropical climate much better than some of the other cultivars that were brought over from Colorado. But yeah, I mean, just with that large of a site and growing and expanding that quickly, there's always going to be issues. I mean, I don't think that there really had been many facilities across the country of that size and that scale up until that point. So nobody really knew how to turn that into a proper production site, anywhere. So
I mean, it sounds daunting.
yeah, it's a huge learning curve, and there's everyone's always going to make bad decisions when but as long as you learn from them. I think building the indoor was a good decision on their part, just to produce the volume and quality that they kind of were anticipating out of the greenhouse, like just wasn't happening. So yeah, I think without trying to look back from an objective place of like, hey, what were we trying to accomplish there? The team on site, the team on the ground, we really did well fending for ourselves a lot, and kind of as this revolving door of direction was happening, we figured out a way to kind of stabilize and ground ourselves to be able to manage all of the people we had to manage. I mean, I had over 40 people that I had to be responsible for at one point. And then I kind of transitioned more into just fully taking on the responsibility of managing the lights and the curtains and the all of the mechanical aspects, and really kind of dived deeply into learning the technology that was at our disposal. Because they had, there were 1,000-gallon batch tanks for each zone that were hand mixed every day in that site. So there were guys in the water room just mixing tanks all day for a long time.
They didn't have any sort of dosing system set up, or
not until they commissioned the climate control system skid, which was towards the end of my time there.
Wow.
I left in end of summer of 2020 when COVID kind of, there was a big transition during that period, and I had to report to somebody who came in very recently, who I had to coach and train and educate. That was basically, I would say it made me feel a little bit undervalued on site there. Without saying too much, I just didn't really I didn't feel appreciated or respected for the amount of sacrifices and time and effort I made. So I started looking for other opportunities and got the chance to move to Colorado to work on indoor craft cultivation, which was a piece that I was really interested in that I hadn't had the chance to do up until that point.
For sure. I mean, the underappreciated and overworked aspect is something. I come from a culinary background before I got into cultivation, and it was, of course, it was like taking people who were passionate about something and abusing that passion for the gains of the company because they were willing to put in all that effort because they were searching for knowledge themselves, right? And when given an opportunity with, such a large facility, I would almost look at that going in and be like, oh my God, this playground that I've been given, I can learn so much from what they have to offer here. But then all that effort, and you have to train the person who's taking over the position that's going to lead you. That doesn't sound like a good leadership decision. I can understand that, and it does seem like an underappreciation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that sort of decision, right? Like, I understand there's a level of, like, I think I preach this often, but staffing, leadership, and culture are really what drive performance in a lot of ways because when you have a team that's passionate, that feels appreciated, they continue to work hard to continue to elevate that, especially when they see upward mobility or at least being treated well and being shown some appreciation. That goes a really long way, especially compounding over larger and larger teams. I think I see the most successful gardens have the most cohesive and cultural teams when I visit facilities. Kind of going back to what I was saying before, but um, you know what I learned through Cureleaf, which subsequently translated into what I did briefly at Be Good, but just having quality communication between people and teams and feeling like we're humans outside of the garden, that goes a really long way. And there's often not a lot of resources allocated towards team appreciation. And I worked at Whole Foods before I worked in the cannabis industry, and they did a lot to try to keep the culture before Amazon got involved, but they did a lot to try to like promote culture within the company and team building, things like that. So there's a I think with big companies it's often challenging to get that right because there's so many different variabilities from site to site and the type of people that are available to work at each place. It is very hard, and you often do have to bring people on from outside, especially to higher positions. But promoting from within, I mean, there's some guys. I have a friend out in Nevada who's very much a very fond of promoting from within and training and bringing people up. And I think your greatest success comes from having people that once worked under you at a certain point elevate to that level of success to be able to go out. Like it's a compliment when you hire somebody and then they get offered a position, at that director or manager level outside. It feels good to know that that person's skill set is evolved and competent enough to take on that kind of role.
For sure.
So I really think investing in your people makes all the difference in the world, especially in markets that are really tight and very bleak, and people don't feel like it's nice when everything's going well and everyone's making money and you're all bonusing out, but when you're having a hard time paying the bills and paying your team and all that, like it's morale is very easily dropped, and it's very infectious when you have low morale in both ways. Morale is a very infectious aspect of the garden. So
I couldn't agree more. That's like some of the biggest things that I feel like the industry faces right now is in this downturn that we're all facing is keeping the morales high enough so that there's still a continued strive for excellence in the product that's being produced, because it can so easily fall to the wayside if you're feeling underappreciated, or if you don't feel as though there is any hope for the future. Basically, when you look at this and you go, man, over the past 5 years we have not been necessarily trending towards this high profit margin that we were at one point. And so I think that investing in your team is extremely important at all times, but especially when times are tough.
yeah, I mean, if you're really good, it's easy for you to get taken advantage of as well. There was a point in my journey at Be Good that I was solely responsible for about 150 light, 140 light facility, and I didn't have any full-time team members over on that site. And I just had to make it work and kind of continue to keep the operation going and turning crops and turning cycles around, even though the facility was horribly inefficient. There was no capital to be able to invest because there was, a previous contract grower that had some conflicts with the ownership, and there was just a lot of mismanagement of resources and leading to kind of a zero-sum game where you're driving your cultivators to do more and more work, less and less people. That seems to happen a lot, where you're like running down to a skeleton crew. So there's a fine line between operational efficiency with minimum amount of labor required to get each task done, and there's a whole between that and like just having the absolute barest bones people on staff to just keep the building open, and you just expect way too much of those people. They have to come in on the weekends all the time. That's just not really fair and not sustainable long term. And if somebody's really good and they can do it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should make them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so especially with no stake in the business or no, and that's a tricky game too. Is like equity is not usually the right move for like a cultivator, but it can be. It's just a matter of what is the capacity and what is the potential future of this business. I've seen so many cultivations in Colorado alone just turn over and go out of business or shut down. It's even some of the what I thought would be some of the more quality businesses. They can't get their cost of goods down. They can't get their selling price high enough. They can't pump out enough consistent crops regularly. I mean, those are some of the key pain points that you see a lot with compressing markets that are built upon a high price per pound initially. Like Colorado took a while to compress, so people didn't realize that $2,000 pounds were not really reasonable anymore until it was too late. They just kept holding on to that.
There's so many people using products like BioBiz and Mills or all these different products that are crazy high price point per gallon mixed, and still just running that because they didn't want to accept the truths as they were coming down the pipeline of the prices continuously falling. And then once you have to learn how to run with a lower overhead and input cost, you start to just see all of these other problems arise because you aren't transitioning in a holistic way. You're kind of slamming the brakes and pulling a U-turn. So,
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the gravity of impact of input costs changes at different scales. Like, I still see guys that are running house and garden, but they're doing well because they're getting higher price per pound and the quality and flavor of their product is better, but they're smaller. They're putting out, very, like somewhere around 100 to a couple hundred pounds a month as opposed to large facilities. So when you're talking to like the gravity of those quantifiable changes in input costs, a couple cents per gallon maybe makes more of a difference at a facility that's selling commodity product. So you have to use something that's going to be way more cost effective because now you're talking tens of thousands of dollars a week or a month, as opposed to like a couple $100 per crop cycle.
sure.
I think that you have to distinguish what context you're talking about, because not always is the change in lower fertilizer costs going to reflect in a better business outcome. And that's something that I think often is overlooked, where we speak in absolutes about, I just need cheaper cocoa, I just need cheaper nutrients, I need cheap lights. Like, all of these factors are much more complicated than just speaking from directly a price point. Because if you're talking economics, you have to build out the whole pro forma on that equipment almost every time. Otherwise, you don't really understand the downstream financial impacts of getting a $300 LED that may go out in 2 years, or that degrades, or the spectrum shifts over time, or whatever the problem might be. Or you get cheap sensors to monitor your substrate, and then you have to constantly calibrate them, and there's tons of labor going into that, or whatever the case may be, where you're actually downstream causing higher labor or costs to, like, let's say you get, I mean, I'm not, maybe don't need to use the sensor thing, but you get a cheap piece of equipment, and now you're not trusting that what you're seeing is accurate or real, and you can't make decisions off of it. There's things like that. Like cheap cocoa has inconsistencies in volume, in salinity levels. Uh, Rock will, there's so many different aspects to input cost. I often look above consumables to just like, operating cost as a whole of like, okay, are you renting the building? Are you, what are your licensing fees on a regular basis? And then how many pounds do you need to produce to get to that point of what is profitable? And the economies of scale are so market subjective. Like Arizona has a lot of massive facilities. Well, they're limited license, so those massive facilities don't have to produce premium top shelf flower all the time to sell all their product out. But Colorado, there's a way higher uh, volume of producers to consumers, so it's a bit more diluted and saturated. So I would say that you have to have a high quality product and check all the boxes in order to have a good brand with marketing that's successful. That's where you maybe producing a few 100 pounds a month is probably too much
Yeah.
because you want to have market scarcity.
Yeah, I think we only do produce around 60 pounds a month or so at our facility. I'm not 100% sure on that, so don't quote me, but we, I mean, it seems to work better to have a little bit of underproduction or scarcity, like you said, so that the market is just continuously eating up whatever it is that we put out. But even still, with the downturned price, it's crazy. I do hope that at some point maybe that there is just like more quality recognition for brands and stuff, because sometimes it feels as though the branding doesn't necessarily reflect the quality, and that can always be a little bit of a hindrance for the consumer when they
Mm-hmm.
go based off of what they see through social media or otherwise.
Yeah, brand transparency and like having a brand that stands up for a specific thing and tries to do its best to fulfill that is key. I mean, there have been brands here in Colorado that have fallen because their quality dropped off, and they were a quality brand, and they lost all consumer trust because their quality started dropping off, and then they just fell off and fell out of the market.
Huh.
So you do have to be consistent and honest and transparent with your brands, and make sure that you're not overselling your brands and saying, "Hey, this is a super premium quality brand at a high price point," but you look at the product quality on the shelf next to another brand, and it's there's a huge difference. So what those quality metrics are is so so variable, and
Yeah.
I would even venture to say like subjective, or sorry, objective. But the uh, the end of the day, like what every consumer shops for product for a different reason. But when you look at market trends, a lot of people are shopping still on potency. Um, Potency doesn't always directly correlate to quality, but quality has a lot of other metrics. I mean, y- your brand has to be honest and representative of the product you're putting into the market and know what your target customer base is and satisfy them. Not
Yep.
everyone's going to be the best quality producer in the state. Not everybody wants that. So if you're
Sure.
trying to sell to the top, to 10% of the market, and there's a, you know, 40% of the industry is trying to do the same thing, I mean, there's only so much room.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It does seem to be this constant battle between quality and quantity that you hear a lot. But I mean, there are ways to achieve both, especially at the scale that where it's feasible for that scale. And yeah, it doesn't seem like it is even possible to have all of, if you say 40% of the brands are trying to vie for that top 10% of the spots, it may just be better to, you know, take accept that maybe there's brands that are better than yours and just try to find your niche elsewhere rather than be in that top 10%. That seems like a very hard that almost seems like a heavy crown to wear, because then you have to maintain it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and every brand has changes in quality and consistency over the years. It's an unavoidable aspect. But the tighter you can get your operations, and this goes beyond branding, being in that top 10%.
Right.
So I think it goes getting to that point of consistency to be able to put out that product in that top 10% goes a lot. It goes far beyond just your parameters in your cultivation and being able to repeat your processes, whether it's irrigation or environment. Genetic selection is a huge piece of that. So, like, really making sure that you're driving new genetic material into the market and bringing in quality cultivars that are sort of setting the pace, right? Because otherwise you're just chasing, and you do have to have a stable of your sort of staple cultivars that people like to consume and know how to maximize those and bring those to consistency. But yeah, again, it's you. I couldn't tell you, like, okay, you need 50% of your garden to be these cultivars that are always selling out that everybody wants, and 50% to be new. I think that's just always going to be a product of what your feedback is from the retail,
Right.
from your buyers. And so many of these markets are like retail plus wholesale, so the strains that the wholesale buyers want are oftentimes much different than what the retail buyers want, but the retail buyers are only buying small volumes, so you have to figure out how to satisfy demand without distributing resources too far.
Yeah, it is. That is a great description of what we're facing here in the Oregon market right now. The wholesaler versus the retailer, and just kind of what each of them are looking for. And it's unfortunate because the retailer is usually looking for higher quality and are more willing to pay a higher price for that quality because they have that direct knowledge of their customers and who's going to come in and buy 2 ounces a month of that product for the next month, and they already know that they have that sold basically. Whereas wholesalers, you just go in and they say, what do you got for cheap? What's the buy one get one half off? What's your deals of the week? So that always is a huge difference in what they're looking for.
Yeah, so you're probably prioritizing the retailers, but then the retailers only can buy so much at a time, and then you have to have, accounts receivable for a lot of these guys, these retailers, because they can't necessarily pay cash on delivery. And for you to get into all of these retailers, you have to agree to some kind of terms in some cases. So yeah, they're paying the higher price point. It may take a little longer for you to get the money, but you're going to get more. But then you have to have somebody fully dedicated to chasing down new orders and collecting, and that game just becomes high labor.
Yeah.
uh, Whereas with wholesalers, if you can just work with a few guys that are purchasing a large volume at a time, and they maybe are paying lower lower price for your product and are less discretionary on the quality, that still is a high portion of your market. So maybe allocating time and energy to satisfying those customers, if they're still driving profits because they're much lower labor costs, that's another whole decision. Everybody wants to be in all the stores and have their product brand be at the top and get all that highest price point, but it just takes so much because you have all of the packaging aspects, all of the marketing. You have to go to these dispensaries, sometimes set up a table, educate the consumers. There's a lot that goes into that, and that's not really my um, sort of knowledge base. I'm not very. I mean, we had retails when I was working at Be Good that we sold directly out of a lot of our product out of our own retail, and a lot of the strains that I was cultivating, either I was bringing in and they would say, hey, this is really great. We got great feedback, grow more of that. Or they were like, hey, do you have this? Can you grow this? Can you do that? And it was like this constant struggle between, because when you're vertical, you have to balance satisfying the customer demands with what is actually production viable in the facility. Everybody
Right.
wants, I don't know what people, I mean, a lot of people wanted very specific things like these really old sativas or like a Durban or something, and we had some stuff that had it in it that was more production viable. But it was this constant battle between like product quality meeting different shelf demands. So we were putting certain products on the top shelf, other strains would go into the middle shelf, and so we were trying to cover all of the bases with one cultivation and a couple of retails that were hitting all of the tiers and the shelves. And I don't know that there was a lot there was a little bit of a still a disconnect there, but from the cultivation our focus a lot was on like what is revenue generating. And I learned a lot, and we made a lot of mistakes in terms of like chasing flavors and wanting to grow certain strains because we liked them, because we thought they were good and we thought they would sell and people would want to buy them. Then we put it out and then they didn't, but then we had all these genetics in production. So we made a lot of we made some oversight mistakes in terms of the business aspect of producing cultivars for the consumer. But oftentimes the the cultivation would be backed up on certain flower because the retail couldn't sell it all because we didn't have a lot of customers coming in. And then it was just back and forth, and then sometimes they'd clear us out, and then we'd be running behind. And it was just a very much like a roller coaster in some capacities. Sometimes we did better than others, so there was a bit of a disconnect. And I think that having the operations that when you are vertical, the that can be really insulating and really positive for a lot of companies because you're not subject to wholesale bulk prices. You can, if you can move your product, so you have to scale it properly. How much are we producing? How much are we selling into the stores? So can we make sure that if we overproduce, can we still get a wholesale price that makes this product worthwhile and viable and profitable? And do we want our
Yeah.
product in other people's stores? Like then maybe we do want to sell out some of our premium brands. There's a lot of different things, and that's just Colorado. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the retail game in Oregon, but I know that I can imagine from what I've heard it's challenging as well.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. I mean, there's a couple vertically integrated cultivation and retail spots, but not a bunch of sort of the mom and pop style vertically integrated spaces that were like in Colorado or Michigan. I believe when Michigan first went recreational, everything had to be vertically integrated, and so things like that. Yeah, I don't see that much out here in Oregon. But when you first entered into the Colorado market after leaving Florida, what were some of the facilities that you were working with other than Be Good? And then tell us some more of the like what you saw and how you developed more of your like the key points in which you direct your cultivation knowledge now. What were some of those things that you saw?
I tried to connect with as many people in the industry when I moved to Colorado as I could because I had a lot of guys that I'd worked with at Cureleaf in Mount Dora that came from Colorado. They came from a bunch of different companies like Green Man and Native Roots and things like that. So I tried to build my network out there and made some friends that were really knowledgeable. That was where I first really got introduced to precision irrigation or crop steering or kind of some of these more uh, advanced and I guess more precise strategies. But it gave me the opportunity to like get out there, see what other people were doing, make some friends, and then kind of get some ideas and bounce feedback off of some of my colleagues where I could really make a lot of the decisions. Financially, not so much, but at least like cultivation practices, like substrate are we growing in, how are we watering, what nutrients are we using, some of these less infrastructural, more kind of subjective, arbitrary kind of things that were based on grower preference and grower style. So it was easy to pivot because the first grow that I was running was 125 lights, and then we had a ton of neighbors. It's in an area that was initially when Colorado went legal. A lot of people started building grows in this particular zone, and so there were tons of facilities in that area, so there were tons of growers there. So it was easy to kind of connect, but then obviously through COVID, people stopped hanging out and connecting. There was a bit of isolation. But yeah, I mean, I kind of got to meet some of the bigger players and some people who were doing things well. But a lot of people, and still to this day, but especially back then, a lot of people had not adopted drip irrigation even, or LEDs were just, everyone was very resistant to upgrading technologies and getting new things. And, it was definitely eye-opening to see how many people were so committed to this like home grower style growing strategy. And you know being able to like dive into, I worked with EST Tech Lighting. That's how I met David. And he introduced me to a lot of different technologies. Arroya obviously was uh, partially through him, just as in he was one of the few people I knew actually had used it at that point. And I had done a demo with them, but we got priced out a little bit. And so there were these like different things like LEDs and how to use them properly, because a lot of people struggled to get yield with LEDs in Colorado. And a lot of it was infrastructural, like people with drywall. Everyone has mold problems here. Everybody's dealing with botrytis or some kind of a aspergillus contamination, where they have to decontaminate flower and they don't have the facilities to drive clean infrastructure. That's one of the things that's really nice about Michigan is people built these grows with like DPS paneling and a lot of the right, not all, I mean, by no means is it like overall kind of dialed, but people did things a bit better because they learned from the mistakes of the Colorado guys and maybe Oregon. You see a lot of drywall, a lot of exposed wood, a lot of spray foam, a lot of things that are like potential surface area contamination risks. And I think that's a major thing I learned a lot about working there, was how to manage microbial issues in the garden and how to manage pest issues as well. But because we had so many grows nearby, we had so many vectors for issues and guys working in the grow that home grows or whatever. But yeah, dealing with botrytis and mold and that sort of thing, like I tried the reactive oxygen generators, HEPA filtration, UV, PCO, whatever, I tried all these different ways to passive and active sanitation, spraying, xerotol. I mean, everyone was doing tons of different things. No one really knew a good solution. Everyone's rad sourcing flower. So, yeah, I mean, to touch back on your point of like, what did I learn? What did I see? Being so close to so many different craft grows and being able to make a lot of those decisions. Obviously, I didn't get to choose the HVAC or the lighting or the racking or anything, so we had a huge problem with runoff, where we really weren't able to drive much runoff because we didn't have floor drains. We had to learn how to steer our plants with the least amount of water and fertilizer we could to get the desired outcomes, which was very limiting and very challenging to get yield because we were having hard times bulking, obviously, and making sure that our pH and runoff was in balance. But that was some of the stuff that was a little bit newer to me when I got there, that I think I developed a really high level of proficiency in, was just doing what I could with what I got, like having to problem solve and troubleshoot and figure out a way around it, around, limitations.
I feel like that builds such a great foundation, though, for future knowledge application, right? So because now you have the understanding of how the parts work, you can take those parts and reassemble them in a way that works better for the scenario that you then have at hand in the future. And I always like to think of it as like a big puzzle, right? And you're building that border of the puzzle, and when you get that last corner piece in or side piece in, everything else starts to just kind of fall into place. But it is a puzzle at first, trying to figure out where the different pieces go. Then once you see it, you get that bigger picture, and you can kind of plug and play with all those different things that you've built your knowledge on over years of experiencing. Let's say like a water line fails, or you need a bypass on something, or you need some redundancy in your airflow or your dehumidification or something because it went down this one time and the whole room turned into a giant mold fest. So you see all these things over time, and you start to build a bigger resilience for issues as they get thrown at you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, dealing with well, if this happens, then we do this, always as a result of having real world experience with those things. It's very hard to solve problems that you've never dealt with without the right tools, or at least some sort of reference, and not being afraid to ask experts for help, or people that have a higher level of knowledge or experience on something. I did that a lot in the beginning. I relied a lot on my network and my people to be like, hey, what do I do about this? What this is going on? What would you do in this situation? Hey, we had this outbreak, or we had this, or I had this person who was really challenging to work with. All of these things, like a water line busted, a pump went down. I had to hand water. There were times when our fertigation skid, I won't say, who it was, but yeah, like I went to go upgrade because we had to do this in order for the skid to function. We had to upgrade the firmware or the software, and I had to replace this component. And it was like over a weekend, and the whole thing failed. So I had to come in overnight and hand water rock wool, like in 2 flower rooms. Just spent the whole night hand watering rock wool, and like that was just like a really, it was like there was no other way to do it. I couldn't, get my fertilizer to mix. So there's little things like that happen where, we had a room flood because the solenoid valve stayed open. How do you bounce the plants back from getting flooded, like entirely flooded with RO water all night? Like, what do you do? You don't want to overwater them, and fortunately at that time I was playing around with some dissolved oxygen bubblers and like little things like, okay, like I know if this situation happens based on this situation that happened to me before, like this is what I think would be the outcome and what I could see being the outcome. But I even to this day I still rely a lot on feedback and ideas from my colleagues, and I think that's what's helped me just in the resourcefulness aspect, right? Like figuring out how to problem solve and troubleshoot things when like building my own I worked with one of the guys at the company to build our own environmental controls platform because we didn't have one, and we just had thermostats. And it was like, how are we managing our environment with just wall thermostats and wall humidistats? So we got some EcoBees, we got some relays, we took the Home Assistant program and we put it all up and built this dashboard, set protocols and signals, and we could look at our trending data over time. And like, that worked like to an extent. It wasn't great, but it was better than not having anything,
Yeah.
So little things like that, or like building out a full irrigation system in a grow that was hand watered without any resources. Like I had to figure out where to get tanks and pumps and solenoids and PVC piping and just scrap it from different places. The old grow, whatever it was, put it on my orders for nutrients so it wasn't like, adding to the cost. Like little things like that, and coming into a grow that had 3 veg rooms and they're all open to like whenever you walk into the grow, you walk right into the mom room, and there's spider mite webs. And so, okay, how do we fix this and consolidate? I mean, the amount of the education I got on solving problems in a highly dysfunctional environment and grow across many of the facilities that I've operated in is, I think, like there's an aspect to it that's like, you learn a lot about what not to do and design and build, but you also learn how to like make do with what you got and figure out how to get to optimal, not ideal. And,
Right.
and that's a conversation I have with people often is, we chase ideal, and I chased ideal for a long time of like, what is the ideal conditions? What's the ideal environment? What's this ideal substrate look like? But if you don't have ideal conditions, like ideal, like, a setting that is, sort of, and nothing's really truly ideal, I guess, because you could always take it to the next step, but making the best out of the environment you have, which might mean, hey, at nighttime, we can't turn our nighttime temps down because we don't have enough dehumidification to pull out to keep that 1.2 or 3 VPD at 70 degrees. So we can't go down to 70.
Right.
So what do we do instead? How do we solve that problem? We can't run the rooms as cold. Whatever the case may be, we can't buy more dehumidification. That sort of thing, like, you're like, okay, well, what's going to be the best outcome with what we do have to work with?
For sure.
And, if we can't run our plants off, how do we stack EC and then also drive EC down in the substrate later in flower?
Right. I feel like it's a common thread on this podcast that we end up bringing up Liebig's law and the different staves of the barrel, and how if you have a limiting factor in one of those staves, then the water is just going to overflow before it hits the top of the barrel. But a lot of people look at that and they say, hey, I want to bring that stave all the way up so that you have a full barrel. But sometimes they need to think, maybe I just need to cut the rest of the barrel off where that stave is so that I can get optimal performance at the, the you have your limiting factor, bring everything else down to operate within the best possible parameters for that limiting factor. Sometimes you end up doing much better than you would think you would be doing when you say, oh, I'm operating at 75%. I'm not going to get 75% of my product. Sometimes you end up getting 85% or 90% of what you might have got at 100% because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you have diminishing returns on yields, based on, as you can only give it so much before you start to see diminishing returns. And so I that's a very, very valid point. I'm glad you brought that up because we tend to bring this up all the time on the podcast, and I feel like especially for home growers or smaller commercial cultivators, you do get kind of lost in the sauce of, I want the best, I want to have everything perfect, I got to make sure that I just optimize, and then eventually you start to see, I can't really get past this one point. It's okay, just bring everything back down there because you were probably producing some fire flower at that level.
Or just consistent, like
Consistent, yeah.
you're not frying your plants by just over revving the engine. Yeah, and I think there's some nuance to that too. Uh, the what I have noticed is, like, let's just take CO2 for example, right? Like, if you which other levers or which other staves in that barrel are more impacted by a limitation on CO2? Like, because in this, I bring this up because I've seen this in facilities recently here in Colorado. There's sometimes a shortage, and like you have CO2 and then the next day you don't, and so you don't have it for a certain period of time. Well, you have to make real time adjustments to your light intensity, and even your nutrient inputs and your irrigation strategies, because you're not assimilating as much carbon into that plant. So that CO2 uptake can, maybe it has a heavier relationship on water demand, but also your light intensity has to be equally changed. So, and this is more open-ended too, but to say, like, some of these limitations, like how I can only do 3 irrigation events a day on my irrigation controller. Okay, well, is it even worth trying to do P2s if you're only getting 3 events? Like, maybe we can't bulk our plants properly and we don't want channeling. So we're like, well, how do we, first of all, the easy, like, obvious thing would be, hey, how do we get more events? Let's put an open sprinkler in or whatever it is. But maybe there's some times where you just don't have that option, or don't have the capital, and maybe that's a bad example, but you're like, well, maybe it's a good thing we can't bulk because we actually can't pull that much moisture out of the room. That we don't have enough dehu to pull as much water that we're putting into the room out, and that's an infrastructural thing. Or we just have too many strains in one irrigation zone. We're trying to water too many different strains all the same way, because we need to have this much variety, but we don't have that much control. I mean, and you still see cultivations that have like multiple stages of flower in the same room. I mean, I've seen it recently, and it kind of shocks me still. But to be able to say, hey, we have one room, so we have to keep the environment the same for all the plants in all stages of growth. The only things we can change is irrigation strategy, and nutrient, maybe even potentially nutrient inputs. But if you have 1 or 2 batch tanks for the whole room, there's little like nuances to this stave, the height of each stave in the barrel at each time. It would be really interesting to dive deeper into the specific dynamics of relationship between one stave to another over leveling the whole equalizer. Like, we're looking at a soundboard and we're trying to equalize everything.
Right. I like that a lot because, yeah, just cutting it all off at that one stave may not actually be optimal. And, if it is, maybe that only 2 other staves need to be lowered in order for you to continue to operate at an optimal output, then you should probably do that rather than limiting everything, especially if by limiting everything else, you're also either reducing quality or quantity, or potentially inviting other issues like mold or mildew or other things like that in. So yeah, the nuances are extremely important, and those are also subjective for the facility that you're looking at, or for the home grow situation that you're looking at. Like one of the biggest things that I see home growers struggle with if they're just growing in a tent is their exhaust versus intake and the positioning for those two. If the tent needs to go hotter, then you need to make sure that you're pulling hot air in and putting it in at the bottom. And if it needs to go cooler, you need to pull cool air in and put it in at the top so that it can come down over the light. And it's just like little tiny nuances that you can optimize, but definitely need to know the situation that you're facing in order to do so. So
Yeah.
after Yeah, and so after you kind of went into the Colorado market, have you remained in the Colorado market since you moved there from Cureleaf?
So I moved here in 2020, got involved in the commercial indoor cultivation then, and I left the last facility that I was operating in January of last year. So ever since, the two facilities that I operated in that I ran here, one, both in Denver, both relatively small, um, very different environment between the two. But long story short is I left due to a variety of reasons. One was the company selling the facility, um, financial issues within the company, and then just other opportunities that presented themselves. I started working as the sort of technical advisor and sales person at Science LED in September of 2023, I want to say. Yeah. So for several months, I was running the facility, uh, and I was working for the lighting company. And we had, you know, several different iterations of that, but part of that was I was able to bring on a couple guys part time to help do the day to day cultivation operations until the we were able to get kind of stabilized to an extent, which led to some complications or conflicts of interest within in money flowing in the company, money kind of moving, and without getting into too much detail, there was a big sort of conflict between the current employer and both employers, and so I had to kind of step away from the garden and focus full time on the lighting company. So yeah, so then that's where I transitioned out of full time commercial growing. It was about a year ago.
Well, and since then, it sounds like you worked at Science LED, and then have also now transitioned over to Arroya, the substrate and environmental monitoring and data platform. Can you talk a little bit about your time there and sort of what your experience has been?
Yeah, I mean, um, I started my consulting business in 2022, just due to a variety of things that were introduced to me as opportunities to generate more revenue, bring some more value, step out of the garden and into the bigger picture of the industry. And it was all opportunistic, right? Like referrals with certain companies that were like, hey, I know maybe you want to work with us in some capacity, but not fully, that sort of thing. Genetics opportunities to potentially create some genetics licensing deals, or work with certain providers that I trusted when other people asked, hey, do you have a connection to a trusted nursery? That once tissue culture started becoming more mainstream in the preservation and cleaning of genetics, I was able to establish some good relationships there. So there was all these little pieces that kind of fell together, and then sort of negotiating. Hey, I have this entity. I'm willing to have an employment contract with you full time while I also have this entity that I'm doing outside, working, as long as there's no conflict of interest. Working at Science was really interesting. I learned a lot about uh, just the mechanics of LED lighting and diode manufacturing, spectrum, drivers, the nuances on driver technology and diode technology and lensing and optics. I had been using the EST Tech fixtures, but I'd also we had Fluence at Cureleaf, and I had gotten some Gavitas, and so I'd used a variety of different LEDs And then I had science LEDs in the one of the facilities in one of my rooms because we got a rebate. So the rebates were really cool. Colorado was really, doing well, giving out a lot of rebates through Xcel Energy. So I saw an opportunity there to leverage my network and my connections and say, hey, I can probably get these lights into more facilities and that sort of thing. So I did that. Got some cool projects in, but I really focused a lot on learning and advising and helping them with their growers because I had replaced the guy who had previously been doing that. There, he'd moved on to another job. So yeah, there was a lot to learn from. We had a lot of home growers. We had a lot of living soil producers indoors and greenhouse. We had a lot of guys that were producing rosin. A lot of solventless that really liked the dynamic spectrum, very small scale, small batch. And then we also had like Planet 13, and we had some bigger facilities, and we were working with a greenhouse manufacturer with one of the larger breeding research facilities in commercial agriculture. So there was a lot of interesting distribution of resources in that company towards different markets, and I really actually enjoyed and appreciated kind of taking a step outside of cannabis too and going to some of these research conferences because I got to go to NCRA 101, which is a conference which is a state of the industry conference for controlled environment agriculture, from vendors to university professors to private research, all that.
Wow.
And that was really interesting. And then, a couple of non-cannabis related research conferences and just general conferences, which was really fun. Because I was also really interested and still am in kind of branching out outside of cannabis. Same with the decision to go to Arroyo. I mean, Arroyo is working with one of the largest raspberry producers in the world and using some of our technology to help grow raspberries in substrate to a much higher yield and all that. So there's a lot there. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but that was really fascinating to see sort of the cross-pollination of CEA and cannabis, because cannabis can sometimes be, for the CEA guys, a black box, or like we don't want to get involved. There's legal issues with research. But then there's a lot of innovations and ability to leverage new technology in cannabis that isn't accessible to the CEA guys as much. So it was interesting to watch those two worlds kind of collide and walk in between them.
For sure. Um, I believe it was Ramsey Nubani. I think he worked at Arroyo for a while, and he's provided some excellent information, kind of circa the era that you're talking about, where there was this push for controlled environment agriculture knowledge and applications to start to be used within the cannabis industry, and kind of vice versa by taking, this high ticket item, commodity item like cannabis, and using some of those extra funds that were generated by its high ticket price to be put back into internal research for some facilities. And it does seem like, like tomato growers have been growing using generative and vegetative steering cues for vining tomatoes for decades, and been using it successfully to produce, extremely highly productive and nutriently dense produce. So it only makes sense that something else like cannabis, with such a high nutrient demand, would benefit from the use of different steering cues and just different horticultural practices that are typically kind of reserved for food production or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really interesting to see these worlds sort of collide. I always point people towards plant empowerment if they want to look into some of the more refined practices and understandings of how plants act and respond to their environment and their different inputs, because cannabis is just another plant, and it is going to do a lot of the things that other plants do, and we typically put it up on this pedestal in the cannabis community as saying that it's this magical special plant, and it does have some really unique qualities, but in the end it is just a water pump, right? It's just putting water from the ground out into the air and assimilating nutrients in the process. So understanding that a lot of plants are like that is, I feel it kind of demystifies, but also opens up an avenue for people to look into different aspects of controlled environment agriculture or other horticultural or agricultural research that is, it can be applied and it can be used for the benefit of the cannabis community, especially as growers.
Yeah, I think a large amount of the resources to that end are being invested in lighting, from what I observed, in terms of like, research ag. Obviously, breeding and genetics is a big part of it too. But what I was mostly interested at science was learning a bit about some of the spectrum research on plant growth and sharing that, because that was a uh, not very well understood aspect of cannabis production specifically, but just plant production in general. Fluence did a good job of doing a lot of research on far red. There's been a lot of studies that have come out on different impacts of red at different times of the day, whether that's actually effective or not. If it's versus 640 nanometers versus 660 nanometers. I mean, there's all these specific nuances that you can get into with lighting and spectrum and timing and whether it actually helps or not, what cultivars, what varieties respond better. So that was one of the things that I was most interested in, but I did see that was quite a big topic of conversation. And irrigation still is a large, nutrient assimilation. Bugbee did a big study on phosphorus. I mean, there's so many um, different approaches within the CEA space to what they're trying to do. So they're trying to do research to figure out how to get better produce, better quality produce, better nutrient density in their produce, uh, more yield, more hardy plants. I mean, as the climate changes and evolves, a lot of the CEA guys are in greenhouses, so they're figuring out like using tools like Coidra to manage the greenhouse, like the autonomous, the grower challenge that they usually win. So it's like, there's a lot of different facets to it, but it is interesting to see. Well, hey, AI and machine learning in general are making their way into cannabis production. There's a bit of uh, gripping that's going on where people want to hold on to the reins and think that they can outperform the machine, and they probably can in some cases, and in other cases probably not. But that's been a huge topic. Like I was at Cultivate last year, and that was a huge topic of conversation within flower producers and whatnot. Is like using these, machine learning tools or these AI imaging devices like hyperspectral imaging or RGBs to predict plant growth and yield and plant health and pest problems, but there hasn't been enough of an assimilation of data to be able to cohesively make those decisions. So it's learning on its own as it goes, which I think is really cool and shows promise. And Arroyo's working on that. There's some other companies working on that. Um, but there's a huge difference in culture between CEA and cannabis in terms of growers and who ego and value and a lot of these aspects and at least that's from what I've observed. I could be wrong, but I've just noticed there's a intellectual property is huge in cannabis, even though a lot of it's just around people checking pollen, and it just things operate differently. Values are just different. But there's
you,
a lot
you
to be learned on both sides.
For sure. You would say then that there's a lot more ego-driven decision making in cannabis than there is in controlled environment agriculture. I take it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely still some in the CEA space, but there's a lot of university research that translates into relationships with farmers and producers there. Um, a lot of the cannabis research, I think people there's two sides. There are people who really appreciate it and look to implement what they're seeing in the research, and there are people who don't believe it or don't like understand it maybe, and don't see the value as much. There's still a huge impact from the legacy culture, for lack of a better term, of the sort of covert operations and uh, the quietness of the innovation and proprietary nature to the cannabis growers that is still just prohibition behavior, but at the same time, like, there's a lot of conversation around, hey, we used to have much better terps, we used to have much louder weed, we used to have, people say all kinds of things on that end, which is probably true in a lot of cases, but we have to understand, like, why exactly is that? What do we have to, what um, bridge do we have to gap to be able to get? Is there fundamentally a conflict directly correlating between production, like production strategy, uh, that is at a sort of a, this is like an open-ended question too, but at an absolute between quality small batch craft and like volume production? I've seen some really good quality product and really, really, really loud flower coming out of some larger facilities. So there's I think it's a bit of a gray area, but I'm curious what you think on that as well.
For sure. I mean, I think that like with the legacy market and there, because of the prohibition era mentality like you talked about, and the there's a lot of unwillingness to share information, and a lot of it I believe is due to the penalties that would have been faced to share that information openly and potentially be tied to that information. Like people like Tom Alexander, who did Sensimilla tips way back in the 70s and 80s. He was a bold pioneer to be able to put that information out there and tie his name to it. That's it's almost unheard of in that era. There was only maybe 5 or 6 people that were doing that and openly admitting that it was them putting that information out there. And so when you get caught up in a mentality of this works for me, and then you get pushed into a market that every last little resource counts, because you are starting to see a loss in price and an increase in overall production. Maybe you want to stay unique in your ways and you don't really want to change, because in general, change is scary for a lot of people, and especially if you've been doing something for a really long time, changing is going to be that much harder. And I feel like that is one of the pitfalls of some of the legacy growers, is not being willing to adopt, not necessarily wholesale change, right? But little things that they could implement to make their lives better. Precision irrigation, environmental monitoring, things like that don't necessarily change what you do or put into your plants or how you grow them or the environment that you're giving them. It just gives you more tools and insights into the applications of those tools. So it's a very, I feel like, touchy subject, especially within the overarching cannabis community, because there are a lot of legacy growers who were pulled into this market because of their expertise at the time, and then basically be forced to change with the market as it's changed. And sometimes that's through their own choice of wanting to stay vibrant and have their potential grow with the market, and then some people that are just stubbornly stuck in their ways. Kind of, I know I'm going kind of on the extremes of both ends of the spectrum there, but it could fall anywhere in between that as well. It does seem like it was something that it was hard for people to adjust, and those who did great, and those who didn't maybe still did great for a while, but eventually they started to see the tides kind of turn on them.
Yeah, the attitude of like constantly trying to learn and get better and innovate. There's a lot of discussion around people switching back to HPS lighting because they got better quality, or you know better flower, or whatever the case may be. That they're saying, hey, I'm going back to hand watering and organics and liquids and HPS lights the way I used to do it, versus like you know driving new genetic material coming out of these new environments where you're actually selecting under your selection pressure comes from the environment that you're cultivating in, that's representative of your high production environment. Like there's a give and take there, but I mean, to me, I would look to like innovations that are not, like, taking a step back is fine as long as there's a clear economic outcome, because it's a business, right?
For sure. Like
And
when I was in right when I graduated high school in 2009, I felt like there was this peak in the, at least in California, in the 215, as well as the gray market, where the quality of product that was coming out of like the Bay Area and SoCal was at such a peak that I can understand looking back at that and saying, man, the weed then was really, really good. It was knock you on your socks good, but also I was, a much less educated and knowledgeable individual. And I feel like one thing my partner says all the time is as we learn more, we know so much less. And it's like by gaining all of this knowledge now in the cannabis industry of the different styles of growing, and we have, probably a million plus different cultivars that normal amounts of people are consuming on a weekly basis, and all that sort of compounding information provides almost this dilution effect of, well, what is quality? And now we know that we have individual and unique endocannabinoid systems that respond differently to different cannabinoids, as well as the different like terpene, ester, and other volatile organic compounds as they coalesce together, and we're responding to them differently. It's not like an ibuprofen where you have one single ingredient that's affecting your system. You have a myriad of ingredients that are affecting your system, and maybe when there were 5 popular strains available to people, you knew that one of them worked way better for you. But now when you have 40, 50, 60 different strains available at one dispensary and 10 to 20 different dispensaries within driving distance, all holding a different menu, how can you even tell what's going to work for you? You can't go through, hundreds of different strains in the same time that you could 5, right? And you have constantly changing menus as well because the production is so much greater now than it was 20 years ago. I just, it's a completely different market, and to say that there was a better, to have rose-colored glasses and look in the past and say that weed was better, I don't believe it. I just don't. I've smoked some of the tastiest weed in my life in the past couple years, but I still remember the stuff from 10 or 15 years ago because it made an impression on me. But I'll remember the stuff from this year and last year the same because it's also a lasting impression.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I've recently, I've judged some competitions and I've tried some, interesting, unique flavors and whatnot. And there's a lot of similarities in a lot of the varieties that are out now that are in commercial production, like, especially because the market demands a lot of the similar flavors. But I get, yeah, what you're getting at is important to point out, which is that and this is partially beneficial to like in the legalization and sort of advent of private research within the industry, as we're able to understand what are all the factors that makes quality experience, or at least like quality product, and its effect on every individual person. Like it's so daunting to try to say, hey, I'm gonna figure out what strain works the best for me. It's like, well, we have to understand why and what those mechanisms are, and it's very complicated.
Sure.
Every person is different. Everyone, just like your digestive system is different than mine, and certain foods aggravate me that don't aggravate you, like, or vice versa. Like that's sort of, I look at it in similarly to that, which is, it all starts with the base material and like how that's cultivated. Like, what are the practices? Once you remove all of those factors, like contamination risks and poor storage and poor curing process or whatever it might be, then you get down to like the raw material input and how that affects you. That's a hard place to get to try to evaluate.
Yeah.
So I think that there's just this like wide world of understanding so many different factors of the plant, that yeah, the production piece is also just a small portion of it.
Right. And then also, one of the things that I feel like it's a little bit swept under the rug when people are asking for the different cultivar that works for them is the understanding of, within the cultivation market currently, you can't have something that yields the same grow for 12, 13, 14 weeks and remain viable for a commercial facility, where most of them are maybe pushing 10 weeks at the very most for a lot of their cultivars. So anytime that you push past that, you can't then ask for that much more money per unit being sold, typically. Maybe for some really high quality product, but in a lot of cases when people are saying, I wish that there was a really good sativa on the market, because I know that that worked really well for me when I had it back in the day. You know, like I said, a 14-week
Like a
equatorial
sour diesel
strain.
or a GMO or something. It's like, yeah, it's just not commercially viable. It you don't see a lot of people growing GMOs like on its own. Like you'll see
No,
garlic cookies or like burgers or whatever. Like because they're shorter, but they still get some of the similar flavors. But they're not just GMO anymore.
no.
And that is a case of we are we have to conform to market viability, which is it could be potentially a sacrifice on that specific cultivar and the people who have had that experience with that cultivar. Yeah, I agree with you on that completely. I think that like the reason that's part of the reason I think sour diesel like was so strong uh, and so popular for a while back in like 2008, 2009.
Yep. Yeah,
All
one of
the
the co-founders of the Craft Growers Network, he goes by Gabby Staten Island, and he was one of the guys that brought sour diesel over from New York back in the early 2000s. And people will still, demand it on the shelves, but from a cultivation perspective, when you look at it as a cultivation to buyer relationship, selling big fluffy green buds, it makes me sick to my stomach as a cultivator trying to see that in a bag and try to go and shop that around, because the expressions you're going to get from a lot of people are going to be, are you the dumbest motherfucker that just walked through my door today? And it's really unfortunate, because then when people see that it's available, they want it. So there is this huge disconnect. I feel like with just across the board when it comes, at all different levels, from cultivator to purchaser to retailer to consumer. And there needs to be a little bit more of a holistic approach in bringing more knowledge there somehow. And that's for someone more intelligent than myself. I can see the problem, but I have no avenue for rectifying that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, social media is a double-edged sword in that regard because social media, especially Instagram, which is where a lot of the cultivators are, is pictures. You can't smell, you can't smell weed on Instagram. It's all bag appeal. So,
Right.
we've leaned further into like this conflation of quality with bag appeal that we never used to have before this was like a thing, before. So yeah, I think that has a big role to play too. Education and teaching people teaching consumers what quality product is. And I deal with this with my family, like elderly family members who are interested in trying cannabis again. Um, but like my parents even, or my cousins or whatever, that are like, I just don't know, like weed's too strong for me these days. Like I can't smoke it. Like I just get way too high, and I want to try to find strains that work for me, or I want low potency weak weed or whatever. They have these ideas in their heads around like what they want and need out of cannabis, but they just can't figure out how to get it or how to find it. There's this like mindset of like, I don't want this high potency, high THC weed anymore. Whereas, that's still talking about THC, whereas it's more, I mean, yes, that number could potentially impact how high you get, but to a certain point, like there's some there's some there's some factors there where testing fraud or whatever, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about there, but I would just say like for some of those
That's a whole
guys who,
rabbit hole.
yeah, exactly, and I wouldn't need to go there, but for some of those guys who are looking for product that's gonna make them feel the way they want to feel off of smoking, there's so much out there, and there's very little resources to help them figure it out.
Yep.
You go rely on your bud tender most of the time.
I feel like it's why I am such a huge advocate for home grower rights, because I feel like that's going to be one of the best routes that any individual can take into trying to find what'll work for them, especially if they have access to clones and readily known cultivars in their area, because then they can try it out at home, compare it to what's at the store. If they think that they like what they do better, then they can, maybe spend a little bit more on a pack of seeds or on a really nice cultivar or something, and set up two small spaces, even one just to keep that cultivar around, learn about cloning and propagation, because that's also a blast in and of itself, and then also be able to grow that product that they want and desire readily. But it is when you are sifting through all the different iterations of, even, like, let's just say something like Girl Scout cookies, right? You can see Girl Scout cookies at every dispensary in some iteration in every state that has a market for it, and they're all going to be different. Mm, Maybe there's going to be a few degrees of difference in some, but in others there's going to be 100 different degrees of separation, and it's going to be vastly different.
Yeah,
So the commercial space is it has a lot of refinement to be done.
I've seen a lot of I've heard a lot of people say that Girl Scout cookies in some way or another killed quality weed, because it was like it made the purple candy gas or purple candy kind of craze take over everything, and that's all everyone's growing in LA, and that's all like it's like, oh, like it totally ruined the creativity and breeding and can, and it's like, I see the point there, but at the end of the day, like it is what it is for a reason. uh it does well in a lot of conditions, and it performs. And I think that the original Girl Scout cookies was not really a great production strain.
No,
um but
like the
it
Forum cut or the Thin Mints cut or whatever, like they're not great producers,
no,
and
not at all.
they're not really purple either. Like they're kind of that, like speckled green and purple with nice orange hairs. It's a beautiful cultivar, but I remember getting like the packs that were in the Bay Area in 2009, and it was amazing. Like some of the best smoke that I can remember to this day. But no one wanted it at the time, when it first came out, because it was weird and different, and people were looking at these tiny little nugs and they're going, man, I just give me some sour diesel or something, or some super silver haze or some blue dream, because I want to see like one big cola in the bottom of my zip when I'm getting an ounce.
Yeah,
I don't want all those different little popcorn nugs. But it did, I mean, it has staying power for a reason, just like lemon cherry gelato, or uh, I feel like there's just too many to name off now, where they're
yeah,
all considered these elite cuts, or commercially viable cuts that do well in a variety of different markets. But that was the same that it was 20, 30 years ago. It was just those markets were much smaller, and the cuts were only passed around to a few people, but those few people provided for a majority of those people in the area, so that it was just, the product was better known.
yeah. I think the breeding world is probably the final frontier of unadulterated creativity in the craft growing world. um, Being able to select strains and make new crosses that are new flavors, and just really try to like hone in what your goals are, and and have, there's not always going to be predictable outcomes with phenotypic variation. So if you're really breeding for a real purpose, that's one like a true economic purpose, like, hey, we're building this cultivar that's going to have these qualities and these things for production, whatever. um, but I also think genetic preservation and looking at like creating combinations of flavors and selecting things that are more for the consumer that really appreciates uh, interesting depth and uniqueness to a cultivar is about pretty much all we have left because everybody really is growing very similarly nowadays. A lot of people
Yep.
are growing in small substrate with high EC, uh, you know, precision irrigation strategies, high out, reasonably high PPFD LEDs, like not crazy, but like, there's a lot of similar practices that are successful in the commercial space that can still produce quality product. So there's not a lot of creativity left within that aspect of it. I think a lot of that is the sacred is left for like some of these more well-known breeders who have a reputation for putting out new quality hot strains.
Yeah, I couldn't
Um,
agree more. It also feels like, because some people will kind of say, well, what about organics? Like what about having some sort of commercial facility that runs an organic system? And my retort would be, well, all of these organic systems that have been found to be successful in an indoor setting are also very homogeneous across. If you take a large enough sample size, that it's all running these fabric beds with something like a blue mat strip system or even other irrigation systems and substrate monitoring, so that you're hitting your same target drybacks and wet dry cycles, and making sure that the electrical conductivity still isn't getting too out of control. And all of these practices kind of then steer back to this controlled environment agriculture conversation that is already a fairly refined practice, and can be applied through a variety of substrates, nutrient inputs, environmental control abilities. It's just, I've we keep on circling back to it, but it's just about making sure that you're optimizing where you can, and and you're not overdoing it where you can't
mm,
afford to.
yeah, simplicity is oftentimes much more rewarding, I think, than getting like lost in the sauce on. I want to need the nano bubbles, and I need to do, I need to defol on day 21, and just having these like precise boundaries that you're sitting within the. It's a dynamic environment, and I think like the creativity that comes from exploring new flavors is all we can have left and hold on to that we can do ourselves in a lot of in a lot of ways. Like I can go into my basement and take a male of this and a female of that and cross pollinate, right? Like that's not very hard. And I can get some really cool, unique, new expressions and flavors based on the genetic potential of each of those cultivars, right? So I could still do that and find something that nobody else has in a way. But at the, like, there are guys out there now doing synthetic and organic combination where they're feeding base salts and adding in, which is not really reinventing the wheel or doing anything new. It's just, hey, I'm putting this kelp fulvic acid combo through a separate doser in line after my batch tank, so I can still deliver these microbes and these biostimulants to my plants and get what I think is creating an increase in flavor profiles and expression in the plant. There is a science to the biomechanisms behind adding those compounds into the plant and the chelators and the biological organisms and enzymes. There's a lot of depth to that argument and to that style. And so I understand, like, okay, hey, this is a new way of applying that strategy that we were doing in our batch tanks and barrels before we were doing all this stuff and keeping our lines clean still. Like kind of adapting in these old school practices to new school production methodologies, which I even don't even like using those terms, but like the legacy versus
Sure.
the modern practice. I think that part of it is very limited in what we can explore in terms of dynamics. I mean, veg time, pot size, planting densities, like very, very myopic decisions that you make that could have substantial outcomes on expression. But I recently walked into a facility where someone was growing in 1 gallon pots and vegging for a long time, and he really, really felt like root circling and constraining of space in the root zone drove a more desirable outcome on bud structure and density and what he was looking for from his buds. over years of his trial and error and experience, that was where he got to in his decision. So they were growing in these large plants in these plastic 1 gallon pots, and like if you're not you have to do a lot of things. You have to make a lot of adjustments to like fulfill the outcome of your specific decision on your observation. There's so many confounding factors, but people have unique things, and then they have to work around that and all the other aspects. Your irrigation strategy has to change a lot when you have too small of a maybe not too small, but when you have a really small pot with a big plant, it's hard to just go full generative. But
Yep.
some strains respond really well to that, and others don't.
For sure. Yeah, like, because sometimes we'll categorize like the different cultivars as being like generative balanced or vegetative themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
and then trying to match those with your environmental cues and your irrigation cues to try and optimize it. Yeah, sure. Maybe over vegging your plant, providing some sort of girdling, which is a stressor, so it's going to provide some sort of generative responses, doing something to the morphology of the flower that is desirable, but it seems like a long walk, to get to the end result that you're looking for. But if it works, it works. And it's really hard to discredit the different methods that people will use that they've developed over time. Like you're saying with this probably single or multi-cultivar growing style that they use for this because it works and they've found that it works, so they're not going to change it. But like we've also discussed previously, that could eventually become a hindrance if some, new strategy or technology or option becomes available in the cultivation facility that you then are either too stubborn to change because of a single method that you must keep to make it your growing style, to keep your uniqueness. And unfortunately, that's a little ego driven at that point. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a balance there. And especially as a consultant, knowing that, some people are just going to be stuck in their ways, and it's about optimizing their ways rather than implementing optimal ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's I've faced that issue as well, and it's a hard one to get used to, especially when you see and have seen so many different styles that you can kind of formulate if you have the education and understanding of how and why plants react to certain things, and you see a variety of ways that people implement those different things to watch how the plant reacts, you can pick and choose what works the best because you've seen it, and now you have your anecdotal model set up, so you're boom, ready to run. And then when other people are faced with that model that you set up for them, they say, well, this doesn't work for my setting because I wanted to do it this way. And when you put this in place, it ruins everything else. So I've faced that. It's one of those things that I feel like is a pitfall for people who want to enter into consulting, where they're trying to maybe push their own ideologies too much and not hear what the people need and responding to those needs better.
Yeah, there's so many flavors of advising or consulting that a lot of it comes down to like, what we're trying to do here is achieve desired outcomes, and then we work backwards from our desired outcome towards what our day to day is, and get slightly more myopic. But in the very beginning, you have to take a holistic, just like medicine, right? Like you have to treat the whole system. You can't just go, like, yes, you have to stop the bleeding and put a bandage on it and all that. But when we're talking about like holistic health, like our whole system is flawed, where we're not eating well, we're not sleeping well, we're not, all these things, right? Like we're hijacked. So in a garden, when you're looking at the holistic aspect, you're looking at what are the key dysfunctions of this operation, and then we work backwards to the specific production things that are happening. And you can look at trends and see things, but it's not always the best idea to just go, okay, we're going to switch to 1 gallon pots at 9 plants under a light at 10-day vet. Like you can't just go directly to those things without a true understanding of revenue generation in the business and what are the key factors that move the needle for the company. You have to look at that first and then go, well, how do these things all play into this?
Right.
At every step of the efficiency is always really important. But efficiency isn't the whole picture, I mean, you got to make sure that the person feels good. And that translates into like desire to make change. And so it's easy to look at like the consulting thing as like a rose colored glass kind of thing. It's like, oh, I'm here to try to help, what are you really doing to support this person? What your outcome based decisions and value based. We're trying to bring value to the company in a way that's supportive, that empowers them to drive success in the business. That's one approach. The other approach is I'm taking a piece of this and I'm going to get the performance out of this. And so that's where my incentive is to like take my SOPs, my strategies, all of my, the way that I do things, and I'm going to place it in this facility, and I'm going to get it to perform the way that I want it to, and then I get the upside of that. So there's different approaches, and it's not all applicable across the board. Some people really just need somebody to bounce ideas off of, or to just tell them when they're doing something that doesn't make sense. And some people want you to just step in and run everything for them and do it all yourself. Every business has this gradient of like involvement and empowerment. And, when you're taking a holistic, systematic approach, you have to look at like, what is the foundation of this company and the culture? And is it owner operator? Is it, somebody trying to sell this? What are they trying to do here? And how do we incrementally change practices and procedures and whatnot to like back our way into that? And maybe like there's this potential rollout of capital expenditure that needs to happen. Like we deal with a lot of consultants at Arroyo. We have a lot of consultants that come in and say, hey, I need to get Arroyo in this grow so that I can see what's happening, so that I can help make decisions and make changes and help them. And that's a very common thing in the industry. I mean, people step in, they implement their tools that allow them to do their job, and then they can, functionally make pull a bigger lever there without as much of a time or labor investment on their end. So, I see that there's such a wide range. Some people are like, we're taking our brand into this grow. We're gonna take these 2 flower rooms. We're gonna run them our way. We're gonna do our thing here. We're gonna bring our brand in, and we're gonna sell the product in our brand from those 2 rooms. So there's like, there's such a wide scope of consulting type, I guess, business. But it's also very challenging when you have to, and I've had this personal experience with clients who didn't get the results that they were looking for because they didn't put in the time and the effort and the work, or they didn't pay, or like, it's like, if you don't pay, you don't listen to someone's advice if you don't have any skin in the game, and if it's just getting advice that maybe isn't as helpful as, or writing out someone's SOPs or writing out an IPM protocol for them. Well, if they don't do it or stick to it, there's 2 sides of that. It's like, either you need to put somebody in there who can, or, and what am I willing to actually do here? Like, how much involvement am I willing to actually have? And do I actually see a potential positive outcome here? Like, when I'm going to help this person, am I actually going to, like, let's be real here. Let's be really realistic. Is what I'm offering and what I have the capabilities and capacity to do, is this really going to help this person? Like, is it really going to make a difference? And, to me, I'm at a point where I don't really want to do that much consulting unless I really like the people and really have trust and respect and know like this is a relationship that's positive.
I mean, you really touched on it when you said trust, right? I feel like even in a non-consulting setting, like let's say you're an employee for a producer, as the producer, you have to trust your employees, and as the employees, you have to trust those that are hiring you in the direction that's being given, as well as the effort that's being put into those directions. And so, when then translating that to a consultant and client relationship, the trust that needs to be there needs to be something that precedes the application of these different methods and SOPs and strategies, right? Because if they don't trust that you know what you're talking about, then they're not going to want to implement it. And if they don't implement it, or if they partially implement it, and you as the consultant are saying, okay, here's the results that we should be seeing when you implement my recipe this way, but you're not seeing those results, and they're going, well, we listened, to what you said, then that's where I can see a lot of frustrations arise, where, unless you have these different abilities to monitor, and then understanding of how to interpret the different data that's being generated by these different monitoring apparatuses, so that you can be like, oh, this tank emptied at this point. I see the dry back here. I see that it wasn't hand watered then when that was the standard, because you saw that the volumetric water content dropped below a specific point. Why didn't that happen? Oh, well, we didn't know
You
that
have
the
to know how
tank
to
ran
look for
dry.
artifacts. That's one thing I like that David uses that term artifacts in the data, because you're like, you have to have enough relevant world experience to know what to look for and what trends typically could mean certain things, and to me, looking at data, it can be a double-edged sword, because you don't necessarily know what to look for always, if you're not trained. But also, if you are, you can get lost in the sauce in the data and just disappear down a rabbit hole in data that's not actually really helping you. It's kind of myopic and getting in the way. When you get lost in the data all the time, like, you may notice things, but the reality is you make observations in the garden, and you validate those observations with the data that you're looking at.
Right.
And so then there's a lot of conflicting potential problems that you could have that could reflect in the same outcome in data.
Right.
Having too heavy of a dry back, or having a VPD swing of like, oh, our DHU went down here, or lights went off and we sprayed here, or whatever the case may be that you're seeing. Like, the decisions you're making are not always live and die by the data, but as more so, how do we, like, look at the data, objectively look at the facility and the plants, and make correlations here that drive quicker solutions and outcomes to improvement in a more efficient and effective way.
Right.
And so that's why I think it's really helpful for a lot of consultants to have more data and more of that. But that's kind of a big challenge too, because it can be potentially limiting for some of these consultants who aren't always on site all the time, who aren't always
Right.
there. Maybe they have to place somebody who's got that skill set to be like, hey, you need to go do all these things and check all, and then I'll look at this from a third party perspective and make some recommendations.
For sure. I mean, it feels like there's a little bit of a misnomer in the industry at this point right now, based on what you just said, where, there may need to be less data-driven decision making and more data-supported decision making, where you're not just looking at the data and making a decision based on that, but you need to, like you said, look at the plants, see what they're saying to you based on, their structure, their turgor, their color, are the pots actually drying back? Is there a consistency across the crop? Are there inconsistencies? Look at those different things, and then look at the data and say, oh, maybe I could tighten up this parameter a little bit more, or I could change this and tweak this, and I can see that based on the data and these different trends that it is going this way or that way, and I've seen that before, it's caused this, so now I can make that educated change. Because sometimes you can look at a nice pretty chart and sometimes think, oh, everything's fine, but then you go into the room and everything's not fine, and you have to then figure out what it is that's causing that. Sometimes I do believe that there is like a tyranny of data, where if you stick to the data and only the data, then you're not going to, like you said, you're lost in the sauce at that point, and you're not really looking at, are the plants healthy? Good. Leave it alone. Don't look at the data anymore, because you're tricking yourself into thinking you need to do something.
You're chasing this nebulous kind of idea that you have, that this one thing you're doing is making all the difference. And you're you like I said, you get lost in the sauce easily. Yeah, and that's really the value of on-site, having somebody on site to really um, help be the eyes. And I think there's starting to see these like Google glasses, or these like, AI assisted technologies that allow you to look through the eyes of somebody else, and uh, in the facility, that makes you be able to, potentially be more valuable offsite. Or again, back to the hyperspectral imaging or RGB cameras or whatever. Like, it's assisted. It's assisted. You're still making the decisions. And maybe the AI will start driving those decisions in a way that's way superior to what we're able to do.
Right.
And then you don't need those types of people. But like, I think that we have to really start to like define what our value is in this space of evolving technology, and not to let the ego get involved and say, oh, I'm better, or it's like, okay, how do we as humans make objective decisions to support people's businesses, right? Like, we're not just here to try to be the best crop steerer or be the best breeder or whatever. It's like we want to make this industry sustainable and have longevity, and still have a degree of craftsmanship and care and pride. That is what we're holding on to in a lot of cases. That's what allows us to love and appreciate what we do.
Right.
I think that we have to strike the balance between production, revenue, and just stewardship of the plant.
For sure. I mean, man, you're really well spoken in this field. Obviously, you have a lot of experience, and I feel like your application of knowledge is up there with a lot of other people that I've talked to that are kind of leading big changes in the industry to try to make this sustainable future for those of us that are not necessarily in this for some ego prize, but because there's so many uses for cannabis, right? Like, whether it be a medicinal use, a recreational use, leisurely use, whether you're using some topical for grandma's arthritis, or if you're using, a giant 1 ounce joint to set the party off right. There's just a huge variety of applications for cannabis, and as cultivators, we are almost the first line in this operation where we are producing what is going to eventually be turned into this myriad of products. And, with all of your experience, both in home growing and commercial cultivation, and through all of these different avenues of optimization that you've taken, for yourself, what are some of the biggest learning experiences that you've had? And let's take this as a two-parter. So what would be one of the biggest learning experiences that you've had that was due to a setback? And what was one of the biggest learning experiences you had that was due to a success?
Yeah, that's a great question. The setback piece, I've encountered multiple situations with setbacks that were both eye-opening and disheartening at the same time. Dealing with hop latent viroid, once we understood what it actually was, we made an executive decision to clear house in our mom room and reset our genetics, because everything was so heavily infected that our production volume was going down. And that was before I really knew best practices to mitigate that. We were victims of the I guess ignorance of hop latent viroid until it was too late. Bringing in genetics from outside sources that you don't trust fully, that was a double-edged sword, because we also got russet mites from that that clone order. That was some of the best cultivars that we had, but we got it from somewhere that was not necessarily, reputable back then, because there were not a lot of reputable options that had really good variety and uniqueness and things that were not out in the market fully. So a naive decision that I made that I, you know, wouldn't say that I necessarily fully regret, because I learned a lot about how to manage hop laden viroid, how to get rid of russet mites, but also like when to stop, when it's time to reset, and like what is the point of critical mass and no return, and then never letting yourself get back to that point again moving forward if you can help it. When you have a problem that gets so out of hand, uh, that you have to make a huge sacrifice. That's that was a low point, but also a big learning curve for me, where I really understood like incremental checks and balances, and understanding like crop registration, even down to that, like sanitary practices with shears. And it helped me manage mold issues in the garden too, because I just took a much more systematic approach. uh, I think that's a big part of it. um, yeah, that's kind of how I would answer that question, in terms of setbacks. The other side of that question is, how did I triumph from a success? Um, I think the successes, a lot of them, there were definitely some successes in terms of product that we produced, quality and yield and whatnot, and like I've had some really good runs. But to avoid the like, oh, the you should have seen the fish that got away kind of story, like I think a lot of it came down to like I felt success with training people. Um, I I I think that I've taken a lot of pride in my ability to break things down and coach and train and educate people. And um, when my first job ever was a martial arts instructor, and then I was an English teacher online, and I, so I've had a lot of jobs and roles and experiences as an educator, I should say. But yeah, when I was working at Cureleaf, and bringing up a lot of people at the same time, and just watching people sort of take to things, or everyone has a very different way of learning. And I had a couple guys that moved on up and ended up in much higher roles, and learned a lot and applied themselves. And um, not to necessarily credit myself for their success at all, but to be like, hey, they have acknowledged that they wouldn't be where they were without me.
For
um,
sure.
I've had some really challenging problems with staff too, where people who felt undermined when I came in, or who felt like I maybe hadn't proved myself, or hadn't succeeded in a certain way that allowed them to have respect for me, which was a projection, obviously, of their own personal insecurities. But to bridge that gap and like build that trust and build those positive relationships, to be to a point where I had a successful collaborative effort with someone who felt very much like I had stepped on them. And then, through the work and my efforts and my labor and my knowledge and everything, to like kind of level with that person and give them opportunities, and then see them successful on their own. That's a success in my book.
Yeah, I love that. It's always so great to see, especially when you are trying to approach it through, not necessarily learning that my method is best, but trying to teach people, like industry standardized best practices, or even just some basic understandings, so that they can make more educated decisions themselves. And then you start to see them make those decisions as you would have hoped for them to make them. It is a really nice feeling, because you can start to see that your style of education is not only effective, but it's working real time, live, right there in front of you. And that's a huge feeling. I can definitely agree with that. I've seen it a few times where I've taught somebody something and then seen them implement it successfully, and it feels really good to see that education is being understood. Because sometimes I feel like I ramble, and I feel like my mind doesn't necessarily work in the same way that someone else's mind may work, and so my explanation of something might just be, too esoterically me to be applicable to their way of understanding. But
Yeah.
through this podcast and even other conversations that I've had with people, it is it is definitely helping to make a lot more of this information accessible to people, and then to make people like yourself or myself or any of our other guests more accessible to the general community, where now they'll see that you have this level of education and understanding, where maybe they'll reach out to you with a question because they feel confident in your ability, because they've heard you talk, they've heard your candor and your understanding of these different topics. I feel like that's just such a huge value to the community in general as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you hosting this podcast too. I think that is really valuable to have. There's a lot of noise and there's a lot of negativity and there's a lot of. It's easy to get caught up in a lot of things in our industry because it's very turbulent, very tumultuous. And I think spreading the word and education from not from a place of ego or authority or anything, just like, hey, we're just here sharing stuff. This is my experience. Nobody's any better than. I often like to use the term principles, like guide a lot of things. So, if you understand the core principles of functionality of a system, or just a way of thinking, then you can always revert back to the fundamentals and the foundations of problem solving and troubleshooting and learning how to problem solve, learning how to objectively make decisions that are based on principles is like the teach a man to fish thing in such an extreme degree.
Right. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Like provide those foundations so that they can build their own program, their own house, basically, rather than, providing all the prefabricated lumber and everything. You want to give them something solid to work from, but not necessarily provide them the whole thing. Because there's such a uniqueness to how each individual wants to operate, not only within the garden, but within life, that it's really hard to give them a cookie cutter and say, just do this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm guilty of that. I wanted that for a long time to be like, I just need the recipe. I just want the, like, I want the irrigation strategy. I want the, whatever it might be. I wanted the solution. Like, I wanted the myopic answer. And it's like, that doesn't really help you. It doesn't help anybody. It just, you're trying to, like, close this box on the specifics. Like, we could go all day into like specific crop steering strategies, but I don't think that really helps people that much from my perspective of like, we don't, you learn the nuances of these very kind of advanced strategies through a lot of your own trial and error and experience when you're trying to make decisions based off of logic and principles and that sort of thing. That's why I try not to get too deep in the weeds on anything, specific, because I just find it to be less helpful than talking about what we've talked about today.
for sure. Well, I mean, we've kind of already gone over our predicted run time here, so I'm going to start to try and wrap us up. But there's so many more questions that I'd want to ask you. The future of the cannabis industry, where you see it going. What do you feel is being like swept under the rug in the cannabis industry now? But I feel like we've touched on a lot of that stuff, kind of without it being direct throughout our conversation. So maybe one of the final wrap-up questions that I can ask is, what advice would you give for new growers entering the industry? You're not, because you yourself are not one of these old legacy growers that has been doing this for 20 years and adapted with the market. You kind of entered it at a late stage within the cannabis game, almost as it was going fully recreational across a majority of the states. So maybe you could address this for people wanting to get into the cultivation industry, or even those who want to just get into growing cannabis in general. But what's some advice you would give for new growers?
I mean, I'm gonna start with values, right? Like, be humble, be curious, use your excitement to learn, and kind of keep yourself within the, like, it's easy to get lost in the weeds, as I just said. And I think if you're a new grower coming in, find mentors, find people who really understand certain things that you want to learn, and diversify those things. And like really try to, I think what helped me the most when I first started working in a commercial facility was that I just wanted to do everything. I put in all, it's work, it was work ethic. It was like, I wanted to work in every department. I wanted to learn how to do all the things, and I wanted to be knowledgeable and useful and valuable. And I found the thing that I was really good at, whatever things those were that I was really good at, and I dug into those and I made a difference and made it, measurable. And I think like just picking people to learn from and picking opportunities that give you the best education, and being constantly hungry and curious, uh, be the first one there and the last one to leave. You can't, that's something that you can't learn from somebody is work ethic, um, and I always found that to be the most valuable quality within my employees to a certain extent. Was like, you could have all the knowledge you want, but if you can't just get out there and do what has to be done, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think that your network and building that network and meeting people and building relationships, they have to go. You can't necessarily do that on top of, like, above and beyond learning the skill and having the core skills and core competencies. Develop those core competencies as much as you can, and also take opportunities to build your network and to meet people and to ask questions and sound stupid and whatever, like just constantly remove the ego and be hungry, and try really hard to diversify and find mentors. I think those are my best bits.
I like it. Yeah, it's be hungry for information and open to that information when it's given to you. And, just if you're going to apply it, assess it, and don't necessarily just take everything for its face value. Because there's a lot of, what's the term? Snake juice, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of bad information out there, and so being skeptical also, I feel like, would go hand in hand with what you're saying. Is take that information but use some skepticism in when you're trying to apply it, and don't just take everything for what people are saying as being true, even if they sound good when they say it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely don't rush the process. One of the things I learned from my early days in martial arts and competing and whatnot was like something that my instructor and master always told me, which was like, you never really lose. You may lose a match or whatever, but at the end of the day, like, you either win or you learn, or you do both.
Sure.
So that's
Like that.
I think it's easy to get disheartened and have the bruising of the ego and whatnot, and know when it's time to walk away and when it's time to move on and move forward, and when you're no longer being served. I think I see a lot of people stagnate in the industry when they're finding like, this job isn't serving me anymore, this I'm not learning, I'm not getting anywhere, and they just fall into complacency and just stay there. Take risks, jump off and do something else, and if you fail, you fail, but like, keep trying. I'm grateful for my opportunities that I was able to move into when I felt like certain places were no longer serving me, and I constantly built my network to put myself in a situation to where I had opportunities when I needed them.
Sure, it's like dig the well before you get thirsty. I've heard that a lot. Well, that's awesome, and I think that's a great little wrap up to our conversation. Of course, because this is a cannabis podcast, we do have a few ubiquitous cannabis-related questions just to wrap up as a sort of rapid-fire finish to the conversation. So, what is your favorite strain of all time?
Oh man, there's just so many for different reasons. But if I think back to like my best experiences on cannabis, it was probably some of the old school hazes, mango haze, some of those really nice hazy strains that I had as a kid.
Yeah. And you grew up in Florida, is what I take it.
Yeah, a lot of our weed was from California, and some probably from New York, but yeah.
For sure. I think mango haze might have been from your neck of the woods.
We had some interesting haze. We had we had a couple Florida haze strains for sure. Swamp Boys seeds and whatnot.
Yeah. Cool. Well, the follow up to that question is, of course, who is your favorite breeder of all time?
Man, that's also a tough question. Um, I used to really like DNA, but I think most of the stuff that I've had lately that I really liked has either come from um, Seed Junkie or um, even there's a breeder here in Colorado called Lovin' in Her Eyes, and
Yeah,
just some really incredible strains. So something like that, or I always really liked growing compound genetic strains. They were
for sure.
always some of the more fun ones to grow.
I'm wrapping up a very small hunt of the blueberry rose from Levin in Her Eyes.
Mm.
I love their products. I also their Instagram profile is always so well curated in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the flower pictures and the sort of mystique to the profile as well, where they don't even always tell you the name of the strains that they're showing. So it gets you that much more interested when it's these beautiful blues and reds and purples and like deep indigos almost in some cases. Their color spectrum that they can produce out of their genetics library is astounding.
Yep,
Cool,
definitely.
man. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
there's
last
a
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was gonna say there's a new breeder in town here that is someone if you're in Colorado to look out for, which is Eleven's Genetics. They have some really cool crosses of old school like headbands and things like that that have some new flavors kind of associated. So there's you get these old school flavors with some of the uh, qualities of modern production that makes sense. So that's one that I really like. Some of their strawberry adhesive is a good one.
That
It's like a
sounds good.
glue. Yeah, it's really good. So,
Awesome. Well, yeah. So, last question. What is your most memorable cannabis related experience?
hmm. Um, like as a kid, or like is this just extremely open?
It's open ended. It could be like your first time smoking. It could be, that time you almost got busted by the cops. We've had a wide array of answers for this question, so don't pigeonhole yourself.
No, yeah. I mean, I would say in terms of like best positive memory, probably would be the first time I ever smoked. Just listening to some music that touched my soul, and I did get busted when I was in college for smoking in my dorm. So that was definitely extremely memorable because they did kick me out of my dorms
Oof.
for smoking it. We I lived in a suite with two rooms, and one of them was these two guys that came from the same town, and the other one was me and my buddy from high school. And my buddy from high school didn't really smoke, but the other two guys did, and it was a cold night. And I was like, "Hey, we should still." We had this window behind the building that we usually climb out of to smoke behind, and this time they were like, "No, we don't want to climb out there. We don't want to climb out there." I'm like, "All right, whatever. We'll towel the door, we'll get the sploof out, we'll open the window, we'll turn the fan on, do all the things, but we forgot to cover the vent. And
Like the shared room vents.
the vent that went into the hallway. And so
Oh no.
the return vent pulled a lot of that air in the room out into the hallway. And like within an hour or so, the TA had called the cops and they banged on the door. And we were watching like James and the Giant Peach or something. And I was just so stoned, and I heard banging on the door, and we ignored it,
Oh.
banging. Finally, I get up, walk out. I was in the room with my suite mates, and I walked out. They closed the door on me, and I was in the little like hallway between the two rooms. Look at the door, and I just see two cops out there, and I just heard one of them say, "Well, if they don't open up this time, we're going in." So I opened the door, and they were doing the whole good cop bad cop routine. They had like the little canine patches on their shirts, and they were threatening to bring the dogs in and searched my whole room and found this like tiny little nug.
I'm
It
assuming
was,
this was in Florida.
it was in Orlando, yeah, and at
Yeah.
UCF.
I was about to say, I haven't heard that level of militaristic style approach to a college kid with weed, unless it was, Florida across to Texas or something along the southern states there.
Hmm. Yeah,
Oh,
no, they were aggressive, man. It was, yeah, it sucked. But I had to do, fortunately, I didn't get arrested. I didn't get anything on my permanent record, but
that's good.
I did. I was in like probation on for with the university for like 2 years after that. So
Jeez.
yeah, I knew in that moment I was like, all right, they're kicking me out. I'm gonna start packing.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
that was
those are both definitely some memorable experiences. So thank you for sharing. And again, Liam, thank you so much for your time today and having this conversation and kind of going deep on a few topics that we don't normally get to touch on with other cultivators. We do a lot of home grow discussion and people who have just entered into the commercial space. But we rarely have people on with your level of commercial experience and kind of understanding of where this industry has been and is going, from the past 5 to 10 years and moving forward. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you being here. And these conversations, as I like to say, are how we spread this knowledge, which is why the podcast is called The Way We Grow, because this is how we grow as a community and as individual cultivators.
awesome. I love it, man. Keep doing what you're doing. I really appreciate you hosting this podcast. It's awesome to see that you're getting some knowledge out to as many people as you can, and bringing on a diverse array of speakers and guests. And yeah, it's cool to see. It's inspiring. So keep it up, man.
Awesome. Thank you.